The movie business may be shifting right in front of us. And I don't mean in the typical theaters are dying type of way. In fact, this weekend actually showed the opposite. Domestic ticket sales were around 179 million, which is actually up 20% from the same weekend last year. AMC recently reported its highest May attendance since before the pandemic. People are still going to the movies, but what's interesting is what they're turning out for. Welcome to the show. Star Wars was just dethroned in only its second week by two low-budget horror movies directed by young filmmakers who got their start on YouTube. Yeah, YouTube. Within just a few weeks of each other, Kane Parsons and Curry Barker have helmed surprise hits that have taken the box office by storm. Both filmmakers are under the age of 30 and started their careers online. Chances are you've probably heard something about one or both of these films by now. Backrooms, a cult horror project that started on the internet in 2019, opened to over 80 million domestically, making it the biggest opening weekend A24's ever had. And Obsession, a supernatural romantic horror film now in its third weekend, has already become one of the highest grossing domestic releases ever for Focus Features. The similarity and success of these two budget horror films suggests something that studios should probably be paying close attention to. Young, unconventional voices and original stories might be starting to drive theatrical moviegoing more than redundant legacy franchises. Now, I don't think the lesson here is just franchise fatigue or YouTubers are the future of movies, but rather that audiences reward original, culturally relevant content. Don't get me wrong, as a movie fan, I don't want to see iconic IP like Star Wars fail. I want Star Wars to be great, but when the return of Star Wars to theaters is overshadowed by two low-budget horror films, that's probably not a great sign. And honestly, it's also kind of exciting because some of the biggest franchises we have today were once original ideas. Not to mention that horror has been giving us some of the best original stories lately. I mean, Weapons is one of my favorite recent examples. Not just a great horror film, but a great story and an original, captivating concept. Yeah, so congrats to Backrooms and Obsession. Hopefully they can keep it going. Now let's get to this week's box office numbers. Obviously, at number one, Backrooms. Again, this thing opened huge. Over 80 million domestic, over 100 million worldwide. A massive opening for A24. Number two, we have Obsession, and this might actually be the more fascinating story to me because Backrooms is the big opening weekend explosion, but Obsession is doing something that's even more rare. It's building. I feel like this film couldn't have probably had that big of a marketing budget because I basically didn't know anything about it until a friend of my wife's told me about it. I always love when you hear about a film through word of mouth. That's how you get numbers like this. A 30% increase in its second week and another 10% this past weekend. Absolutely wild. Meanwhile, The Mandalorian and Grogu dropped a whopping 70%. That's basically a complete collapse, especially when you consider we're talking about Star Wars here. For reference, a 40 or 50% drop is what's usually considered normal in week two. Woof. Unfortunately, this is what I saw this weekend, and I'll be honest with y'all, it was the definition of mid. It felt like a Disney Plus show, which I guess is what The Mandalorian has always been. At number four, we have Michael. Michael has had serious staying power, especially globally. I really enjoyed this film myself. Even though it did feel a little incomplete to me, I'm really glad it's doing so well. It's actually nearing the $1 billion mark worldwide, so we'll see if it can get there. And if it does, who knows, maybe we'll get a sequel. At number five, we've got The Breadwinner. Not gonna lie, don't know much about it. It actually looks kind of charming, so I won't be checking that out this weekend. I'll be going to Backrooms, but if that's your cup of tea, go for it. And rounding out the top 10, we've got The Devil Wears Prada 2, Pressure, The Sheep Detective, Passenger, and Mortal Kombat 2. All right, moving on to Around the Industry. This is where we'll talk about several of the biggest movie business stories of the week, and our first one ties pretty directly into what we've already kind of been talking about today. Michael DeLuca, co-chair and CEO of Warner Brothers, warned studios about cutting too deeply into developmental budgets.
The North Star is the relentless pursuit of new talent and fresh voices, and a way to refresh the pipeline. Because if you don't look for new voices and new talent, and you rely on what's worked before, innovation dies within your organization.
If studios want more original movies, more young filmmakers, and fresh theatrical hits, like we said, those things have to come from somewhere. They have to be developed. Studios love to say they want originality, but then a lot of studio strategy still ends up being safe, recognizable IP. And maybe that's the real takeaway from this past weekend, that not every hit has to be a massive blockbuster. Sometimes a unique perspective and original story is enough. That being said, Marvel's our next story. The Russo brothers have been talking a little bit about Avengers Doomsday recently, and a phrase that stood out is Phase Zero.
So get ready for it. Look, we were with Robert Downey Jr. earlier today. We were both talking about this concept that we are back to Phase Zero. This is starting over from scratch. We want to make sure everybody feels like this isn't leaning on anything from the past.
But Phase Zero is interesting because it sounds like Marvel knows the MCU needs some kind of reset. Maybe not a full reboot, but after Endgame, the MCU has definitely felt a little aimless. Bringing back the Russos and Robert Downey Jr. is a smart decision in my opinion, but that doesn't automatically fix things. And hopefully they can stick the landing if Doomsday and Secret Wars really is a quote-unquote soft reboot. Alright, moving on to some more Marvel adjacent news. Tom Holland apparently delayed making Spider-Man Brand New Day so he could do the Odyssey with Chris Nolan.
When Nolan first offered him a part in the Odyssey, the production dates were identical to those of Spider-Man Brand New Day. Holland's commitments to the Spider-Man franchise are ironclad. So I said to Chris, look, I want to do this movie, but if I'm going to do it, I'm going to have to call Sony and have a very uncomfortable conversation, Holland said.
Honestly, I get it. At this point, it feels like every actor in Hollywood wants to work with Christopher Nolan. And when you look at the cast of the Odyssey, it's basically everybody. Tom Holland is obviously essential to Spider-Man. They're not going to make that movie without him. But a chance to work with Nolan on a massive theatrical epic, that's probably not something to pass up if you can avoid it. And finally, we have to mention AI because it just keeps coming up. This week, there were a few AI-related stories floating around. Martin Scorsese using AI-assisted tools for his storyboards, apparently. Emily Blunt rejecting AI in her voice work for Disclosure Day. And Adam Shankman denying that generative AI was used in Stop That Train. To me, these all kind of point to the same thing. AI is now part of the public conversation around movies. But there's a big difference between using AI as a planning tool and using it to replace actors, writers, artists, and just human creativity. That's why it's pretty cool when you hear Emily Blunt actually say that the alien noises that she makes in Disclosure Day, that's really her. And that's actually a perfect segue into our trailer of the week. This week we're taking a look at the final trailer for Disclosure Day. So obviously this week we spent a lot of time talking about younger creators and lower budget movies, but Disclosure Day is not that. It's the other side of the conversation. This is the GOAT making an original sci-fi film. Oh, you even got sound from Spielberg in here. So it's almost like a documentary trailer. Little BTS trailer here. I mean, this is the guy who made E.T., Close Encounters. I mean, sci-fi is kind of his wheelhouse. So when it comes to Spielberg and this type of thing, he knows how to do this right. And I think this trailer just does exactly what it needs to do. It gives us just enough to understand the general vibe and the feel and the scale without giving away the whole movie. I mean, I kind of hate when trailers do that. Yeah, when you talk about an original story, I cannot wait to understand what's going on here. All right, now let's look ahead at what's coming this weekend. All right, let's start with Scary Movie. This is technically the 6th entry into the franchise, but it's the first one they've made since 2013. And right now it looks like it's gonna be the likely winner. It's tracking really strong. And like we've said, horror's hot right now. I know, but this is kind of comedy too. But this is pretty nostalgic for a lot of people. I mean, I grew up with these movies. Then we have Masters of the Universe. This is the big risk of the weekend. I understand why studios want this to work, but I'm skeptical. There have been a lot of successful toy brands that have been converted to movie franchises. I do wonder how broad the appeal is in 2026. Then finally, we've got Power Ballad. And this is actually my dark horse for the weekend. I mean, you've got Paul Rudd, Nick Jonas, and I'll be honest, this is the one my wife is probably the most excited about just because there's a Jonas brother in it. In a weekend full of brands, horror, big budget, nostalgia, Power Ballad gives adults something lighter and a little more sincere. Well, that's it for this week. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video and you want a weekly breakdown of what's happening in movies, box office, news, the business behind all of it, go ahead and like and subscribe. It would mean a lot and really help grow the channel. I'll be back next week to take a look at what actually happened at the box office. Until then, see you at the movies.